delighted to be part of the 40th anniversary celebrations of the now iconic Paro that continues to charm, shock, delight readers across all generations. We've changed the format of the session a bit today. We are going to be joined by the very versatile and erudite Pragya Tiwari, who will also give us her perspective on Paro and also the connections with Never Never Land, the new book that's going to be launched today. We are also joined by writer Eric Chopra, who first came across Paro last year. He mentioned that the book impacted him profoundly, and it's really interesting. We're very keen to hear how Paro connects with someone of his generation today. We have a video before we get into the questions, so can I request someone to play? Namita, many congratulations once again. You were in your 20s when you first wrote Paro. So the first question is, what was a nice, good girl like you doing writing a scandalous book like Paro?
Well, those of you, there's been a change in the program, as you know, and some of you may have come for the Ramcharitmanas session. So I'm sorry to disappoint you in that case. But that was a session I was looking forward to, and I swapped with my session because Yatindra Mishra had a problem on dates. I was never a nice, good girl. I looked very demure, but I have, first of all, a rather violent temper, which I have displayed once or twice today with people who have been unforgiving of my sore throat. But I think what it made me realize today was that it's very important to be a writer, because even if you lose your voice, you never lose your voice. That book is out there to carry it through.
But do you also want to tell us a bit about how it was when Paro first came out? I mean, there genuinely was a complete furore. I think it shocked a lot of people. But at the same time, it's got some marvelous reviews, which we continue to see till today. I mean, I think just a couple of weeks ago, I saw a couple of people write about Paro and how it resonates with them.
I was 26 when I wrote Paro. I'm 68 now. When I wrote Paro, I was married. I didn't show it to my husband. I left the manuscript lying around here and there. It was my father who saw it first. He said, "Child, what's this?" Because he saw one typed out. Those are the days of electric typewriters. "What's this?" "I'm writing a novel." He said, "Dreams of passion. I hope you've been discreet." I said, "Yes, I've been as discreet as I know how to be," but which is not much. And then my husband, I was typing it on this early electric typewriter, very few people had them, which had an autocorrect thing. and a Japanese businessman came over. He was a prying kind of guy, and he looked at the desk at this typed out thing. He took out the paper, showed it to my husband, and he said, Rajiv-san, what is this paper? And it was one of the steamier scenes from Paro. So, I think people got offended because it was funny about sex. I don't think it was the sexual passion session. It was not the sexual bit that offended people.
Yeah.
Women were not allowed to laugh at things sexual, mainly to do with that main rather pathetic character of BR and his masculinity. So I think that is what offended a lot of men.
And were you aware at that time that you were actually going to start a whole new genre trend? Because in so many ways, Paro has been the front runner of a lot of books after that, and you actually started an entirely new genre.
Well, I was before my times. It's never fun to be ahead of your times. My friend Shobha De made a career out of writing the sort of book that Paro was. I never went back to that. And I remember a new edition of Paro came out. And do you remember somebody called Preeta Maitra?
Of course.
Preeta reviewed it for Sunday. It was the most nasty review possible, saying every writer tries to copy Shobha De, and Namita Gokhale is trying to copy her. And then Veer Sanghvi wrote a letter back. He was the editor, saying, sorry, Preeta, but this book came out 4 years before.
Yeah.
So it was just, it's very important to be neither ahead of your times nor beyond your times. But I think women were just beginning to realize that men deserve to be laughed at a little bit, and women also. But they didn't need to take everything so seriously, whether it was sexuality, whether it was the boss's, seductiveness, whether it was anything. It was just a funny book.
There aren't...
And here to add to something, audience, one of the things that weathers really, really badly is social comedy. Because with social comedy, the way people laugh changes, the jokes change, the sense of humor changes. So what surprises me most is that it has weathered the change in social mores.
Absolutely, and we are going to hear a bit about that from you actually, because I think it's very struck by the fact that you've also written a blog on how Paro affected you, and we'll hear about that. Just a couple more questions. I hope your throat can last.
Yeah, I think it can.
I also wanted to touch upon the very intriguing, nuanced, complicated relationship between Paro and Priya. There are not that many complicated, you'd call them frenemies today, and do you want to give us a bit of insight into both, and maybe what really inspired you to write such diverse characters, but also there's this very nuanced sort of, relationship that goes on between them?
I don't know where that relationship came from, but I saw around me, we used to run a magazine called Super, and in that office there, I used to watch the girls who were working there. There was one girl, she wasn't like Priya at all, but she was a very good person. She was intelligent and she was good. And I know that she longed to be bad. And I think there are a lot of good girls who proclaim that they are good, but they don't have the courage to be bad. It needs a particular courage to be Paro. And the relationship comes from the fact that Priya doesn't disapprove of Paro.
Yeah. I think she wants to be Paro at many levels, but just does not have that. Yeah, she doesn't want. She can't push the envelope there.
I think many of us want to be Paro.
Yeah. What would Paro be like today if you were to perhaps place Paro in the current context? What would change?
I think these days, in the time of social media, where every woman or every man is trying to project themselves all the time through different photographs, images, clever talk, you don't get the genuine article so much the thing is that Paro was and is an original. But there are a lot of women, also men, who are projecting themselves. But the voice doesn't have that genuine element of not caring.
Yeah.
The thing is, Paro didn't care. She didn't want to be liked, she didn't want to please, except when it suited her. And so I think a lot of the figures around in social media and things, which I watch quite carefully, somewhere they're trying to please, even in being bad or wicked or whatever. That there are so many stereotypes and cultural figures floating around. People want to be like that. Paro didn't care.
Khushwant Singh once said that Namita Gokhale writes about love, lust, and death. And even from Paro, from the time you wrote your first novel, death has been an important thread in all your works. Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
I'll tell you a funny story. Can you give me some water, my darling? You know, Khushwant Singh made this line, which is a really good blurb line. And I've used it in more than one book. Kahin you don't know what to say, put in Khushwant Singh's love, lust, death. I mean, which you cover all kinds of readers. So for this new book, Never Never Land, it was my old editor, Ravi Singh. And he said, what should we put a quote? Let's not put a quote. I said, should we put in Khushwant Singh's old quote, love, lust and death? He said, yes, Namita, my dear, but you don't have enough lust in this book. So who wants to read about love and death?
Eric, should we move to you? I was very struck by your talking about Paro and how it affected you, and also in the context of, you said you just watched Animal. And so Paro resonated, and what Paro stands for resonated for you at a very different level. So do you want to just tell us about that?
Yes, thank you, Hemali. I would actually like to say that Paro does turn 40, but when I read it last year as a 22-year-old, I felt this is a book of this time. This is a book of each time, each epoch, I think, can resonate with a character like Paro, because much like how Priya cannot figure out who Paro is, neither can the reader. She emerges sort of like a philosophy, an idea, constantly under the inspection of what I call Priya's prying eyes. And I found the book fascinating because what you would say in Gen Z lingo, Paro is the movement. She is the it girl. She is an icon. And I was relating to the book at every page except those parts where Priya would talk about getting a job, and she would say that this is my salary, I'm very happy with it. And I would think in 2023, 2024, I am not happy with it. So I would realize this is a book that was written in 1984, and yet all of it seems so relatable. However, I did not write my blog till I reread it after watching Animal, and a few more movies that have been doing the rounds, a few more texts that have been doing the rounds, wherein I feel like the liberation of a man is always at the expense of women or of the oppressed. Whereas a book like Paro, there is so much liberation. Paro is in her own, living life in their own terms. And yet at no point I felt like any man's liberation was being threatened. And therefore it felt that a book written 40 years ago is so refreshing in that way. And a movie that is doing the rounds time and time again, in which clearly I do believe that every man who is liberated is doing it at the expense of a woman. It did not sit well with me. I came back from the movie in the middle of the night. I did not go to sleep. I opened the book again, Paro, and I wrote down a blog. And from that, I would like to just read a small excerpt of what I make Paro to be. For me, Paro is a liberating expedition that challenges Moors while cleverly satirizing the fragility of the urban upper middle class society. Set in the 1980s, it is a tale of love and loss, passion and pleasure, and dreams and daring, against the backdrop of the lavish and flabbergasting life of the elite of Delhi and Mumbai. The intricate dynamics of socializing permeate the novel, and although it appears to be dripping with relationships, whether platonic, romantic, or hierarchical, at no point can one really discern what these people truly feel about one another. Their first world problems shine as they host extravagant parties, sometimes even multiple housewarming events. Marriages and friendships concretize and collapse. But while the opulence of it may all seem surreal, a thread of reality is maintained through Priya's excessively human voice as the narrator and the author of the novel within the novel. So while Paro is constantly making you enter a world that seems like can only be a reference group, that you can only hope for, Priya's voice keeps bringing you down to reality, which is what I found to be so fascinating.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Pragya, Paro, Priya, Never Never Land. Tell us about the transition, and you mentioned that you'd actually read early proofs of Never Never Land. So we'd love to hear from you in terms of how you've actually seen this transition from Paro to Priya to now the latest novel.
So I had first read Paro when I was about 23, and the book blew my mind. And I was used to reading the feminist novel. I thought I understood the genre as a young woman. Of course, I understood nothing, let alone feminist. But what I was used to, and I'm not a literary critic, so this is from a very subjective point of view, the kind of books I was reading that were feminist novels were about women who suffered. And of course, this was important documentation. And that's how I began to see the feminist novel, that it highlights the suffering of women at multiple levels. And then came Paro. And I had no idea. It made me so uncomfortable. I distinctly remember the feeling of sitting on my bed and reading Paro and feeling extreme discomfort that I couldn't place. Over the years, I processed Paro. Over perhaps more than a decade, I processed Paro. And she would reveal herself to me at very uncanny moments in my life as I was growing up and negotiating my place in the world as a woman and my own understanding of, my dharma as a woman. She would come to me and reveal herself, aspects of herself. So that's the way in which Paro stays with you as a woman. Earlier, Namita spoke about, or you spoke about, how all of us perhaps want to be Paro. I would say all of us are Paro. What proportion is a different conversation. But when I was reading Never Never Land, I've been fortunate to read almost everything Namita has written. And Namita, like she said, she doesn't go back to writing what she writes, right? So when you're reading Things to Leave Behind, you don't think of Paro. You don't think this is the same writer because she has such range, marvelous range as a writer. But when I was reading Never Never Land, Paro came to me like a scepter. And on the face of it, there's nothing in common between Paro and Priya and Rosinka and Leela or Lily, who you will meet in this book. Rosinka and Leela are two old women with a very, very complex friendship, sitting in their dacha in the mountains. And the book sort of documents both their friendship and the violence and unevenness of the friendship, and yet the heart of the friendship. And you recall Priya and Paro, but they couldn't be more different as women. So I kept thinking, why is it that I'm thinking of this? And the more obvious answers came to me. Because Namita does in this book what she's so good at doing, world building. So when you're reading Paro, yes, the characters come on for 5 minutes and you know them. You really know them. You know them like you've known them and they're part of your family. They'll be sitting in your drawing room and they're friends of your fathers and so on. She does world building so beautifully, even in a novella. She writes about the mountains so beautifully. I don't think anyone can capture the beauty of the Himalayas and the mysticism of the Himalayas like she can. She writes about the human condition and friendship so well. And in my head, I kept thinking, that's probably what's making me think of Paro. But eventually I realized what's really making me think of Paro is that Namita's pulled off a Paro in this book, even though it's not a book It's not a retelling of Paro in any way. But she wrote Paro against the grain. I won't say behind times, ahead of times, against the grain
Yes.
in the 80s. She's writing this against the grain as well. And allow me to explain, indulge me for a minute. We live in times, of course, the feminist novel has come a long way. Of course, a lot of stuff that was written in Paro that was absolutely scandalous in the 80s will pass muster today very easily. But there's also, due to gender identity politics, at least to my mind, there is a certain anxiety about how we write women and how we read women. And for good reasons, I'm not taking away from that. But I realized that Namita has this uncanny capacity to tell the truth without artifice and apology. And that sounds simple, but it is the toughest, damnedest thing to do, especially when writing women. To my mind, I cannot think of another writer who writes women like Namita writes them. Paro goes through a lot, but Namita makes sure we don't feel bad for Paro. And that is what is radical about Paro. And that's what's radical about Never Never Land. They're such flawed, complex, beautiful women. And you see yourself in the suffering of women. But in Namita's women characters, you see all of yourself. You see the parts that you don't put on social media, that you don't even see in the mirror because you're so afraid of them.
Absolutely. Namita, do you want to talk a bit about Never Never Land before we formally unveil the cover?
Yes. Never Never Land was written almost as quickly as Paro. It took me 6 months to write Paro, and it took me 5 months to write Never Never Land. I began it in February last year, early February, and I just went on writing on my phone, really. A friend of mine, Lakshmi, is sitting in the audience. She wrote 290,000 words on her phone, while I just wrote 39,000 or some little less than that. But I didn't have any idea what I was writing about. But the story formed itself without planning. No person who ever teaches you about writing will say just begin. But it came out. And later when I read it, I found there were so many strands from my other novels. There was a lot of Paro. There was a lot of a Himalayan love story. There was even bits of A Book of Shadows. So I think having written 23 books, a pattern has begun to emerge, though none of my books are like each other. But out of necessity, some things do repeat. So I can now find those strands. And if some readers find them, it's good. If they don't, it's still good.
Wonderful. Never Never Land is available at the bookstore here.
Just 100 copies.
Just 100 copies, so please go get them. And now I'd like to invite everyone to unveil the cover. And Atika Gupta from
Manasi,
Speaking
you
Tiger.
also come as an editor.
And
Hello.
Mansi Subramaniam, old friend, editor. Please join us. We have time for a few audience questions. So I think there are people around with mics. Please raise your hand and we'll come to you.
While we wait for questions, there's one thing I would like to tell the audience. that cover, the cover painting is by Rorik. And somehow, Rorik is very lucky for my books. First, Speaking Tiger did a book called Himalayan using a Rorik cover, and it's done really well around the world. Then HarperCollins, at my suggestion, did a cover by Rorik for Mystics and Sceptics, and it's really a beautiful cover. And in this novel, the cover is by Rorik, but Rorik also enters somewhere into the story just as a... So I'm hoping that this cover will be lucky, because it's the third Rorik cover I'm doing, or may even be the fourth, I may have forgotten.
Lovely. There's a question in the second row, yeah.
Hi, I haven't read your book, but I wanted to understand as an author what is going through your mind when you write books like Paro. Is that what you want to be, or is that how you want the world to be, or what is that? You've written 23 different books, so 23 different ways of Namita Gokhale, or is it something else?
I have to tell you that when I'm writing, my mind is completely blank. My own opinions don't intrude at all. I don't know where the stories come from, or even where the opinions come from. Go with a blank mind, and I write. And I'm often surprised by what I write, and there it is. It's as though, and a lot of writers have told me this happens with them, that when they are doing a book or a novel, it's actually as though they're watching a film or something. It's like on a screen, or in another life, or in another dimension. These books exist, and I'm just the medium to tell them. When it's not like that, I know that the writing isn't good.
Thank you. Any other questions? That's it. Thank you very much. Thank you, Namita. Thank you, Pragya. Thank you, Eric. Yes?
No, we can ask each other questions.
Would you?
Yeah, let's continue the questions.
Yeah? Okay.
People, you ask me a question.
Actually, that's great, because we thought that maybe your throat may not be able to, but we'd love to continue our questions.
I'm going to ask you a question about Never Neverland, because we've transitioned into that. We've just launched this book. The feeling, it's taking off from what you were saying, that you write with a blank mind. There's also, there's a feverish quality in The Blind Matriarch and Never Neverland. It feels like you've just sat down and written it all in one go. As a writer, how much of your book is written in the first draft, and how much of it is hindsight with editing?
The book that took several edits was Things to Leave Behind, because it was a historical novel, and I wrote it in pieces and it didn't hold together. That had to be stitched together. But the others, they just came. Very few edits. Manasi is sitting here, she did The Blind Matriarch. It was written in real time, it was written in COVID, so I would write it, send it to her. She'd put a tick mark, and I'd go ahead and do the next and the next and the next. So...
one last question about Never Neverland. What is your relationship like with the women characters in this book? There's Iti, who's the sort of narrator of the book. There's Rosinka and Lily, who are the mainstay of the book. And there's a very interesting wild card in the form of Nina. I won't get into Sunita. And so between these, what is your relationship with these women?
Well, after I finished writing this book, I realized that Priya and Paro had been reborn in these new characters of Rosinka, who is 102 years old, and of Lily, who's 90 plus. So it was the same people, just the situations were different, the times were different. So I think, and I had promised myself I won't write any more fiction. And I've still promised myself enough of fiction. This one just came through, I don't know, it slipped through the cracks.
But I think that's a very interesting way of looking at your body of work, reincarnation instead of a continuing thread, because I see that even in when you were speaking about Never Never Land, I think about it when I have read The Book of Shadows, one of my other book by Namita, which I absolutely loved, in which there are pages after pages in which the voice of a ghost keeps on going and keeps on speaking. And I find it fascinating that in each work you do get shocked and stunned that this is the same writer, because I went from Paro to The Book of Shadows, and these are two completely different books. Here is a ghost living in a house in the hills, haunting that house, but in a way that is very welcoming to, as a ghost who is, impassioned and romantic. And then transitioning to the ghost from Paro was shocking, and yet I could see reincarnates of characters, and I think that is a continuing sort of thread in your body of work.
I hope so, because I've been told by two of my publishers, David R being one of them, that how will I ever have a body of work if all the books are so different? Because readers expect something. He said if you'd wanted to be a real success, you should have gone on like Paro. You had hit the jackpot there. Why did you change? But I'd done my best with Paro and it worked. Anything after that would have been a failure. So, but it's... One more question from the audience, please. Meri laaj bachane ko. Koi pooch lo and then we can.
Hello. I come from China. I'm also a writer in China. I wrote 18 travel books. I really love you. I think you have an attitude. Do you think you're going to publish your book in China one day?
I would love to, because
we have a large number of the readers. Yes.
No, I think I would love to publish it in China because I've read a lot of Chinese fiction and I think it would resonate. The ghosts would resonate. The women, strong women characters would resonate. I hope you're right and that I find a Chinese publisher soon. I'm very lucky to be a part of this festival. But as a result, what often happens is that I do neglect pushing my own career as a writer. And if I was able to push it a little better, maybe I would have had a Chinese edition by now. But now that you've said so, I'm sure it'll come. Thank you.
Thank you. And I really respect you and wish you a long life.
Well, on that note.
Actually, this session is the one that keeps giving. I think I just had one more question, which is inspired by the question about languages. What about Indian languages? Because that's the other part that you've been very invested in. What's the reception been like? I don't recall how many languages Paro might have been translated in, but is the kind of audience interaction or reader engagement similar? Can you tell us a bit about that?
Many of my books have been translated into Hindi.
Yes.
Some have been good translations, some could have had more work on them. I think Shakuntala was probably the best. But all of them, they've got a very good response from the Hindi market. Because the themes are like that. But now one of my English non-fiction books, Himalaya Ek Khoj, has come out in Hindi, and one or two of the people in it got very upset. The translation hasn't worked. But the whole point of translations is it's a different book and it's a different audience. So it's not about my book speak in translation. It's about every book finding the right language for it to travel in.
Namita Gokhale, thank you very much. Pragya, Eric, this was a wonderful session. I'm sure we'll be back here to celebrate 50 years of Paro. And till
dear audience, thank you for putting up with my 30 bars in throat.